So far in this topic, we have looked at the calculation of realized return and expected return. We now turn our attention to required return. The required return is the return we need from an investment to make it worth our while investing. The key to determining the required return is risk, because the higher the risk, the higher the required return to compensate us for taking on that risk. Risk has a lot to do with uncertainty about the future, but it means more than just not knowing what the future holds. The concept of risk allows us to quantify our uncertainty. Although we don't know what will happen in the future, we can use information about what is likely to happen to make decisions. Risk is also referred to as variability or volatility. It allows us to measure how much variation we can expect to see in the range of possible future outcomes. In the previous modules in this topic, we have looked at the concept of return, and we have just now defined the concept of risk. Having done so, we can draw some conclusions about the attitude of investors towards return and risk. Basically, the more return, the better. But in terms of risk, most investors are risk averse. Being risk averse means that all else being equal, you would prefer less risk rather than more risk. And therefore they require extra return to compensate them for taking on risk. It doesn't mean that they'll avoid risk at all costs. It just means that in order to take on risk, they require extra return to make it worth their while. We can therefore draw the following conclusions, and these are important because they will underpin our discussion of portfolio theory later in the module. We can conclude that all investors would prefer the maximum possible return for a given level of risk, and that risk-averse investors would prefer the minimum possible risk for a given level of return. Earlier in the module, we saw that risk indicates the degree of variability in the range of possible outcomes. In this case, returns from an investment. The amount of variability, and therefore risk, can be measured by using the statistical measurements of variance and standard deviation. These measurements tell us the tendency of returns to be different from the average or expected return, and how far from the expected return those returns tend to be. Once we know one of these values, we can calculate the other, because the standard deviation is just the square root of the variance.